Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. I'm June Rawl, the IPDAY Florida Director for IPDAY, and I am just so super excited that all of you are with us today on our ESL series. This is the first of many series for ESL instructors. So today we have joining us and facilitating our conversation today is Jamie Addleston Goldstein. Jamie has just such a wealth of information. She comes to us today as a teacher, a Florida State trainer, a national trainer, and all through her career, she has managed and facilitated many multiple projects with the U.S. Department, Office of Career and Technical Education, and of course, adult education. I know her passion and her drive for her work is so evident in everything that she touches. And I know and am confident that today you will benefit from the wealth of resources that she will be presenting and interacting with you today. Before we get started, I know you know the housekeeping tips, but I'm going to review them with you very quickly. If you have a question, please type the question into the Q&A option that is on your screen. Remember that your microphones are muted. You are in listen-only mode. Today's presentation is recorded and it will be available on the IPDAY website within 48 hours. The PowerPoint and also the handbook that Jamie has made for us is also available on the IPDAY website. So without further ado, I am going to present to you Jamie Addleston Goldstein and thank her so much for being with us today and welcome.
Thank you so much. I'm going to stay on camera for a very short period of time just to welcome you all and to say how happy I am. It's a little earlier on my side of the world. It's about lunchtime, but my glycemic index seems to be fine, so we're going to hope for the best. We're going to start with first things first. June's told you a little bit about me. You now know that I am in California. I need to find out a bit about you. And this is, of course, what we would want to do with our learners. We would want to find out everything we could about our learners. So could you please answer these three questions? Your role, the level of your learners, and the context within which you work. And we'll do this with the idea of maybe, let's see, right now I'm not showing that anyone's participating, but let me make sure that you can see the poll. Will you give me a Y in the chat if you can see the poll? We're going to use the chat a lot today. Perfect. Thank you, Rachel. We may have a slight lag between what I post and what you see, so let's just play along with technology. So I'm going to let this stay up for about a minute or 85%, whichever comes first. Those of you that are in cars or not able to participate in the poll, please know that I value your role. And this is very, very important for us as instructors to know our audience. So what I'm seeing right now is it looks like we are a majority of instructors, but we are also varied. And if you have an other equally important role that isn't listed here, please put it in the chat. So we have a teacher at a state prison. We have literacy, that would be the foundations level. And we have a professor, okay. So I'm gonna close it down in 4 seconds and I'll share the results with you. So what you can see here is that we've got about 58% of those 67% responding are instructors. So that's an important element for me to be aware of, but it's also very important for me to notice that we have coordinators and instructors and PD providers. And as I mentioned, some of the other interesting roles that have been mentioned in the chat. You can also see that we vary in the learners that we're serving. And while this is particularly an ESOL webinar, we have ABE ASE learners being served, and we know that many of our learners are English language, our learners in ABE ASE are English language learners. Please use the chat for any comments to me, and for the interaction and the questions. I'll open up a period of time when I'll ask you to pose questions, because I think that will really keep us within the appropriate time. I want to be respectful of your time and your search for knowledge. Also, please notice that I need to know how you're delivering instruction. So right now I can see that more than half of you are in person. Some of you are doing hybrid. A little less than a quarter of you are doing 100% virtual. We have one teacher who's doing high flex, and then we have some other choices as well. So you can see that much like every adult learning situation, we are varied. But now I'd like to go for the affective. So on the side of the chat, you see a little emoji face. And I'd like you to tell me which emoji best represents you at the moment. And you can search, just as I show you. When you click on the emoji, you'll get a search bar if you'd like. You could put in a noun, you can put in an adjective, you can put in a feeling. So go ahead right now and just click on the emoji that best represents you at the moment. So I'm seeing right now that Yvonne has got a rather blissful emoji. We've got Rachel with a curious emoji. Ashley's feeling kind of high-spirited. There's a question about turning off the chat. You can close that window, but I will tell you that part and parcel of doing this work together is the participation within the chat. So you might just want to move the window to the side if it's distracting you, or you have agency, just click on the little red dot, just like you would close any window in a PC or Mac. So it's very important for us to know our learners' affect in the setting so that we can anticipate whatever lesson we planned. If there are triggers for our learners, we want to be aware of those. And certainly we want to make sure that we really have a deep sense of who the people are sitting in front of us. And I know that that comes as no great shock to any of you. We also want to make sure that our goals are transparent. So in the spirit of transparent goals, I want us to be able to feel confident about defining backward design. That was the title of our session, Forward Thinking with Backward Design. And I'd like us to really have a strong sense of how it could support ESOL lesson planning. It also supports all types, ABE, ASE lesson planning. I'd like you to be able to use a set of questions to help design or refine your lesson plans. And then I'd like you to be able to locate the adult education standards and competencies in the Florida Adult ESOL curriculum framework that correlate to your instructions. This is probably the easiest goal because it's a link. And I'm going to make that link available to you right now in the chat, but you'll also see it in the workbook handbook that June referred to. Now, we have a two-part professional development opportunity. We have our synchronous work we're doing now, and we have the asynchronous that has to do with both the workbook and viewing the webinar another time if you're so engaged. So after spending time with the workbook and the ideas from this session, you should also be able to use a variety of assessments. And this is something that we can't do. It's not a one and done. It takes some thinking. So to use the variety of assessments to help your learners demonstrate their achievement of lesson objectives, to be able to analyze a textbook lesson in order to determine what stages need to be adapted or added, and to select from lesson staging templates, which I've given you both in the workbook, and we'll give you a link to that today as well, and be able to integrate gradual release of responsibility in your instruction. All of these take a little bit more processing time than the ones that I set up for you previously, the previous goals. And now I will leave you visually and we'll continue on with today's essential question. Essential questions, driving questions, guiding questions. These are the background, the underpinning concepts for what we're teaching. They answer the learner's question of why are we doing this? So I've come up with three, The first one is probably the one that would drive my lesson planning for you, which is what makes an English language lesson effective. But you might have the driving question of how can we plan effective lessons when our time and resources are limited? And then again, we both might come up with how can we plan for optimal teaching and learning, or learning and teaching? So these are the questions that will drive my planning of instruction. And they have very specific features. Wiggins and McTighe in 2013 are the ones that really coined the concept and the features of essential or driving questions. They're open-ended. So it's not a convergent yes, no, one correct answer. They're open-ended. They're thought-provoking and intellectually engaging. They call for higher order thinking. They point toward important transferable ideas. They raise additional questions. They require support and justification, and they recur. So it's not just, I'm not just going to ask that question about what makes English language teaching effective once. It's not a one and done. I'm going to keep revisiting that question because that's part of my growth. Learning never ends. It's kind of our mantra. So with those features in mind, let's take a look at analyzing those 3 questions that I presented to you for our time together today, because this is an adult learning opportunity. So what makes English language lessons effective? How can we plan them when we've got limited time and resources? And how do we plan for optimal learning and teaching? Are these questions that are worth asking? Give me a Y in the chat if you think so. Are they open-ended? Is there one answer in the chat for these questions? Not are they hot, but do they promote higher order thinking skills? Thank you, Amy. So these are types of elements that we need to ask. Do they have to meet all of these criteria? No, but they should pretty much meet these 3. Do they raise more questions? Absolutely. If I ask what makes an English language lesson effective and I say, well, planning, then I have another question, which is, well, what kind of plan? So it's this process of examination and analysis that isn't about putting pen to paper. This is something that I want to share with you, is that when we are thinking about this stage in our lesson planning, we can be doing this in the shower. We can be doing this on the drive. This is about the joy, the art of English language instruction. So do your answers, do you have to justify them? Do you have the justification and the evidence for them? Are the questions engaging? HOT stands for higher order thinking strategies or skills, sorry. Thanks, Ashley. Do we want to keep asking these questions? And my answer is yes. And are they transferable? So could I, as an ASE teacher, use this question in the context of my teaching? And I would have to say, certainly questions 1 and 2 and 3, yes. So I'm about to give you a mini presentation model of a lesson plan. And what I'd like you to do is to think about what you notice and what you wonder. A notice and wonder activity is a great way to engage learners so that they're aware that they have the right to question. They have the right to focus. I would say we want them to focus. So you have the choice. If you have the workbook in front of you, and I saw that Ellen's posted it. If you have the workbook in front of you, you can look at pages 4 and 5 in your workbook. If you have a big screen and you want to put that up while I'm talking about the slides, but you might just want to look at the slides and listen. And as I'm speaking, ask yourself what you notice and what you wonder about what you see and hear. This is the first part of my lesson planning outline. Now, I'm not saying that this is the template of all templates. This is what I'm choosing to share with you today. There are many ways of setting this up. This is just giving me a frame to share with you so that you can see one option. You'll also find this in the materials that ACE did for the last 2 years with the ESOL framework. So this shouldn't be too much of a shock for those of you that have some experience with the framework. So you'll notice that this is for a high beginning class. So I've indicated my level right up at the top. Let me make sure that you can see that. So it's, oops, let me go back. We'll start, I wanna make sure that I do sequence. So they've got the high beginning right up at the top, and my topic or theme, what a shock, is work. Now, we do not have to do work every single time we plan a lesson, but because we know that workforce preparation is really important for our learners, I've chosen that as the focus for this particular lesson for us to work on. Then I've got my guiding or essential question, and that's not just for the lesson, it's for the unit of study that I'm doing. And so that question, let me make sure I hit the right thing. That question is, what is a good job? You know, we say to our students all the time, oh, you know, if you study hard, if you work on your English language acquisition, if you put in the time, you're going to be able to get a good job, a better job. Well, what is a good job? And that is an open question, and a question worth asking in terms of all students. And students may have different answers, which we would expect, but they would then justify their answers. So in talking about what is a good job, in general, I want to think in terms of what kinds of soft skills what soft skill requirements make for a good job. And so to that end, my objective is that students will be able to list, state, and clarify their skills and abilities in order to speak about themselves in a job interview or another situation. Now, remember, this is high beginning. I have a fairly complex objective, but the language is going to be at the learner's level. So they can talk about what they can do and what their characteristics are. So it's not going to be that the language is going to be beyond the level, but the objective can be something that is 21st century, dealing with the complexity of our world. So list, state, and clarify. Now, the next part of my outline is key. In many cases, we would go right to the tasks and the activities that we would do, but that's not where I'm going to go. I want to go to, how will I know that they're going to do this objective? How will I know that they've met it, that they can list, state, and clarify their skills and abilities during a job interview? I'm guessing that you've already guessed how I'm going to know. I'm going to know through performance-based learning. So they're going to initially brainstorm skills and abilities. So I want to make sure that they have the vocabulary, but then I'm going to give them the opportunity to role play, and I'm going to assess that role play with the rubric. So I'm going to know that they have the abilities that the objective has called for. Then I'm very much going to get into the land of language. And I know that my learners are going to be reading about these soft skills, and they're going to have to scan for details and text features. But when I show you what it is they're looking at, you'll see that the scanning is a little bit different. The speaking and listening wise, I'm going to have them listening for details and clarify, and monitor and self-correct. I see that we have a question about that the IPDAY homepage is where that link was to the workbook. June, maybe if you could clarify where the workbook can be found. I will give you the resource folder that I have, which has some of the materials from the workbook, but you will actually want the PDF workbook. I've just put the resource folder in there for those of you that might be interested.
Yeah, we'll put the link up too, Jamie. That will take them right to it.
Thank you. So I'm thinking ahead of time of what skills and language strategies learners are going to need to meet that objective and to be able to do that proof of learning. I also want to think about the key vocabulary, obviously skills and abilities. And I'm going to use the Oxford Picture Dictionary page because this is a beginning high class, and it's going to help me to have visuals to support the meaning of the vocabulary. However, I can also use this to teach reading strategies because, as you'll notice, and I'm going to point this out for you, I hope in a meaningful way, These headings or subheadings are a reading strategy to be able to identify the sections of a reading, and the bold-faced words in the vocabulary are the verbs. So that's giving learners an opportunity to use their reading strategies around this particular page as well. So I'm going to be using, this is going to be my language that they're going to work with. Also at the bottom of the page, since this is the text that I'm using, I have some options for practice activities, which we'll talk about in a minute. And then I'm not forgetting grammar. Grammar is an essential element of teaching English as a second language or English as another language. So the learners, as I mentioned before, I believe, they'll be able to say, you know, I can solve problems. I am patient. This last segment is something that I'd like you to think about, whether this is something new to you or something you've already been doing. And that is correlating the lesson plan with the standards and competencies of the Florida Adult ESOL framework. And when I pop this up here, it may mean nothing to you if you're not overly familiar with this framework. Would you put in the chat a Y if you have seen the framework and know what these things mean up here? Go ahead and give me a Y for yes. You don't have to put a no. I'm just taking a look. June, it's a real good thing that you said yes. Well, as I mentioned earlier, and I put the link in, I'll put it in again. The standards are really an element of 21st century adult education that we need to focus on, because these are the skills our learners need to navigate 21st century complexity, to navigate the technology-rich environments in which we find ourselves. And I'm guessing that you all have the inference skills, if you haven't seen these, to know that R is reading and SL is speaking, listening, and L is language. And we'll go into this a little bit more as we move forward. Now, the second part of my lesson plan outline is the staging of the lesson. So now I have a picture, a big picture of what the lesson's going to entail. And now I need to start thinking about it. So I'm going to warm up with who can whistle, because that's a nice way to start building a little community. Of course, I'm going to check in ahead of time to see how people are doing, find out, you know, if anybody has something important to share. But then I'm going to move into who can whistle, and we'll do a really short little bit on that. And then I'll work with actions versus skills, because we've been talking about hard skills and agent nouns. We've done this previously, so that's review. What do teachers do? And the warm-up is trying to get students to name the types of skills that a teacher needs or a builder needs. And we would go with that for a short period of time. Now it's to me to share the objectives with the students and to make sure that for those who do not have a workplace goal in mind, that they can see the value in learning how to express your skills in other settings. And I want to survey my students to find out, how interested are they in this? Do they think it's going to be hard? Do they think it's going to be easy? Just connecting with the learners to make sure that there's relevance, an adult learning principle. Then I get to my presentation, and I'm going to do an interactive presentation by starting with teams brainstorming all the skills that they can think of. And chances are most of those are going to be hard skills, but I might be able to pull out some soft skills from there. And then based on what they don't know, I'll teach new vocabulary using the early production questions. Now, if you're not familiar with early production questions, I would suggest that that's something you could Google and find a lot about, because they're very, very useful. Notice that in this outline, I'm also setting up my timing and my materials. This is truly an outline. I'm not spending a lot of time detailing everything I'm doing, nor am I giving all my page numbers, but it's giving me a little bit of a sense as I'm planning how I'm going to use the materials that I have. I start the second part of my lesson making sure that learners are ready to move on. So I confirm their understanding. In this case, I'm doing true-false statements. I have them do a pair work exercise using that from the Oxford Picture Dictionary where it says, tell me about. And I know that some of you have probably used side by side in your life, and that kind of drilling where they're substituting concepts is it's a very comfortable, safe, guided type of practice for learners. So I can have them talk about the people on the page, tell me about her skills and abilities, tell me about his skills and abilities, and then tell me about your skills and abilities. And the learners having to go back and forth between using can and be. But now we get to the heart of where the learners are really putting this language to work for themselves. So they're going to do a role play. And as I said before, the team and the teachers will use a rubric to assess that role play. So what you can see is that I've put two stages of the lesson together. We're doing both communicative practice and evaluation. This is a great way for conserving time and energy. Your application can go with your evaluation, or your communicative practice can go with your evaluation, especially if you're doing performance-based assessment. Now, my application in this case is really short. It goes back to that beginning where I introduced and said there are other places and times you might ask about, tell me about your skills. And so the students would, with me, brainstorm those different contexts. This is an application of what they've learned to other contexts rather than a deepening of the language. And it's very important to close a lesson. You need to make sure that learners have a sense of completion, even if the lesson content is going to continue on to the next day. You want to be sure you affirm the learner's learning, give them a chance to self-assess their learning, preview what's coming the next day or the next few days, and then adjourn. In this case, I'm using exit tickets, which is sticky note or the chat for the learners to respond to a prompt, and then I preview the next lesson. Notice the timing here. So that's 5 minutes up at the top, but do you notice where the majority of the time is in this part of the lesson? It's where the learners are using the language. So I'm giving them 45 minutes of a 2-hour lesson. This might be a 90-minute lesson. I can't quite remember. Sorry, I'd have to go back and look. But they're taking the majority of the time to do the work. And this is so, so critical when we're planning, to make sure we're planning sufficient time for them to do that. Okay, that was a lot of talking and fast too. So what I'd like to ask you to do right now is there you see again, sorry, the materials. In the chat, I'd like you to tell me something you noticed or something you wondered. And I'm going to try and write some of the ideas up here on the screen. So what's something you noticed during that little spiel? And what's something you wondered about? And this is where we should have the Jeopardy theme song playing. Okay, so preparation can pay off with a notice. Important to teach vocab. Details in the plan. Timing is key. So we start with basically creating a big picture and working backwards. assessing students. The importance of being thoroughly prepared. Oh, here's a good one, the wondering. I love that. So glad that you brought that up. So wondering about other contexts, students who aren't into work. That didn't come out right, but you know what I meant. Aren't interested in the workforce. Can anyone propose a context for students where they could talk about skills that wouldn't have to do with work? And then there's a question about the lesson plan being over an hour long. Exactly. So if I wanted to do an hour lesson, then I would plan it for that hour, and I'd plan those same stages, but I would limit my my objective. So my objective would maybe be that students would be able to state their skills. And then the second lesson would be students would be able to state and clarify skills in an interview. Okay, so Amy's positing life skills, communication skills. Students are having a lot of interaction and communication, a person's hobbies or interests. Think about, I don't know, putting up a profile on social media that talks about your skills, going to volunteer at your child's school, being able to say the skills. I also think we could go to dating. And that universality, great point. You notice I've stopped typing because I want to make sure that I'm seeing the information coming in on the chat. But you can see that this is a way when you're virtual and your learners have limited resources, limited access. If they're typing on their phones, you can be then typing onto the site. And when they go back off the chat, they can see everyone's answers. A life skills going to the bank, great. Adjusting the plan to accommodate. Life skills going to the doctor, right. Now, in terms of the skills that you could talk about, I'm able to, but the soft skills, which is what we were dealing with, I'm willing to learn. So if a doctor says, do you know how to, or can you, then that concept that we had about willing to learn, not yet, but I'm willing to learn, would definitely come up there. Great work, everyone. Thank you so much. So that's a notice and wonder activity. Again, giving you permission to look at something and say, how does that work? But also to heighten your noticing. And you did a lovely job of that. Oops, and it always helps to clear the annotations. What a rookie move. Okay, so in the next part of our time together, I'm going to work on the objective of understanding backward design and using the questions that will help you build backward design. So planning with the end in mind is a name for backward design, but backward design has 3 stages. And that first stage, oh, excuse me, let me do a sideline for a second. And that is to answer that you can teach English as another language, as a second or other language, if you don't speak another language, but speaking another language gives you a great deal of empathy for your learners. So that's just something to be aware of. So the first stage, heading back, the first stage of backward design is to plan for the desired results. And that planning starts with essential questions and objectives. Once you have that, then you're going to move into stage 2, which is determining the evidence of learning. How are you going to know that they can do it? What kind of assessments will you use? In many cases, we want to use assessment all the way through the lesson. We don't just want a summative assessment at the end. So just like I had that comprehension check where they did a true and false and when they knew the vocabulary, I might also have them assess a model using the rubric, which I'll show you in a minute. And then last, which is kind of counter to the way many of us were taught, is building your learning plan after you know what it is what it is you want them to do and how you know they're going to be able to do it. So that's where your tasks and materials come in. So the question about formative assessments, I see there, a formative assessment is a low threat assessment. It's something that both teacher and student can use to determine whether they move on. So a true false, a yes no answer card, a quick write 3 things you recall from what I just talked about, 5 words that you want to learn, 5 words that you remember. So formative assessments, and there's so much on formative assessments for you to look at. And I can put some additional material in the resource folder if you're interested, or I'm sure IPDAY has additional resources as well. So here are those questions. You do not have to recall all these questions. Let them float over you because they're in the workbook, and they're also, you'll have the PDFs of the slides. Question 1, what do I know about my learners? What do they need to, want to be able to do? Do I know their goals, needs, interests, etc.? It's all good and well for you to have a marvelous textbook that has been really well researched and was written by someone 5 states west of you who's never taught in your particular class, who doesn't know the state requirements of Florida. It's still a beautiful textbook, but it needs to be adapted to the people that are sitting in front of you. And if I, as a textbook author, I tell you, I've told everyone this for the last 25 years, 30 actually, that we don't teach the textbook, we teach the learners. So use your textbook, and we'll talk about how, but first things first, what do you know about your learners? And then based on those answers, what will your learners be able to do by the end of the lesson? So I have literacy level learners in this class with my beginning high learners. They're not going to be able to do the same objective. And next week, I'm talking about differentiation, but I have to be aware of that differentiation. I have to know that need for differentiation in order for this lesson to be effective, in order for the assessment to be accurate. Oops. And then question 3, what evidence of learning will show me and my learners that they've met the objectives from number 2? These are the 3 things that really have to drive you in your lesson planning. And then, of course, once you have that, what language will they need? And language includes skills, strategies, vocabulary, grammar. What standards does my lesson seek to address? I like that. It's very noble. I seek to address these standards. You know, the standards keep being sought after. It's not a one and done. So they're working towards the standards throughout your period of instruction. And if you have limited time with your students, you're not going to meet all the standards, but you have to prioritize based on those standards that are most meaningful for your learners. And finally, what instructional routines? That means tasks, that means activities, that means drills. You know, what materials and instructional routines will support my learners as they work toward the lesson objective? So this is what, this is what you need to be thinking about, these questions that will help you guide you right into your lesson planning. Now, heading back to one of our goals for today, I just want to make sure that you have access and know where to find the standards. So they're mentioned on page 8 of the workbook, but the PowerPoint also has this link up at the top, and you can see kind of what it looks like on this little tipsy page. But within the framework, you have the CCR, College and Career Readiness, anchor standards. In this case, I'm showing you the reading standards, but you also have level standards. So if you are teaching a high beginning class, reading anchor 1 is going to be broken down for a learner at your level. So you're not going to be, this is the final standard. The anchor is what you're supposed to be able to do by the end of your advanced level ESOL. And then the Florida curriculum framework also contains the English language proficiency standards. And one of the great things about the ELP standards is that they integrate the skills. So while the CCR have reading standards, writing standards, speaking, listening standards, language standards, the ELP standards that you see here integrate, which is much more what we do in our instruction. So you can see that Oops, I thought I had that highlighted. Let me highlight it for you. You can see that they're constructing meaning from oral, literary and informational text, and then they're listening, reading, and viewing. So when you're looking at these standards, you may find a closer correlation to the way you think about teaching English language. Oops, and back we go. And then not to forget the life and work competencies. And you notice that in my lesson, I hope you noticed that it was employment and workplace communication. So these are the different subject areas, and within each of these subject areas are the competencies. Now, one thing to be aware of is that textbooks have correlated to all of these things already, and you're probably aware of that. But if you're not, it's good to know. Finally, after you've asked yourself those 6 questions, you want to ask what lesson staging best suits the content and instructional routines in the lesson. So the WPIA lesson plan is what I showed you: warm up, introduction, presentation, practice, evaluation, application. And within that, practice is guided and communicative. And within presentation is the comp check. So that's a very standard type of lesson plan. It's based on Mastery Learning by Madeline's last name, something she disappeared on me. It's with an E, it'll come back to me. But there's also task-based, pre-while, post, and the writing process. And these lesson plan templates are in a Google folder, and they're in the workbooks. I've just put the link to the lesson plan templates in the Google folder. And there's also the writing process lesson plan, which goes with pre-writing, then drafting, then revising with feedback, then editing, then publishing. So there's various ways to create lesson flow for your learners. Let's take 5 minutes to just do a deeper dive into assessment. How do we know they can do it, and how do they know? This is so important for our learners, for the learning process to be transparent. So a 1-point rubric really does help. Rubrics help you with assessment, and they help learners recognize what they've accomplished. They also set up, if you look at that criteria for the role play, they set up what is expected of the learner during the task. So in this criteria, they have participate in the task, manage their time, state at least 2 soft skills, use the not yet but willing to learn response appropriately, and speak accurately and clearly enough to be understood. Now that's comprehensibility. And you notice that the column with the green check, that's saying that they met the criteria. Maybe they didn't do a stellar job, but they met it. And on the right, those 2 columns on the right, that's giving me an opportunity as a teacher or as a learner to self-assess what went well and what do I need to work on. Even though I maybe met the criteria, maybe I could do X a little better. So this, as you can tell, is not the same as the analytic rubrics I'm sure you're familiar with, or even the holistic rubrics. This is the 1-point rubric, which I think from the standpoint of our time and resources is something that we can make use of again and again. This is for role play. So all I need to change, if the context is different, is probably the 3rd and 4th criteria. Here's an example again. This is for teamwork and presentation. So we've got them now following task instructions, because that's an important skill. I'm going to give them a checklist with the instructions, but they have to follow it. I want them in the presentation to make eye contact, and I want them to be able to respond to questions. So I've put this in because this is what's allowing me to make the qualitative speaking, listening, performance-based situation quantitative, because I can say they met 3 out of the 4 criteria, or they met 3 out of the 5 criteria. So this is a way for me to really assess very clearly and effectively. I hope you find that to be true as well. Also with assessment, we want to ask our learners to do things that engage their higher order thinking. So on the right, on the rectangle on the right, you see some of the skills that they should demonstrate during, not all, they don't have to demonstrate them all, but those are skills that they could demonstrate during a really effective assessment. On the left, having them explain what they've learned in their own words, or teaching what they've learned to others, justifying their responses. Those are all things that play into the skills on the right, but they're also things that we don't necessarily think of when we think of an assessment. Very often we think about multiple choice tests, fill in the blank. But we want to give learners an opportunity to really process the language that we've been teaching and to demonstrate their ability to do that by actually saying or writing about what they've learned. Here's an example of an assessment that I think you'll find quite fascinating. And I'm going to put this information in the chat because I want you to know what links the learners had to work with. So this is from Robert Lee, who teaches in Delaware County. He's a Teaching Skills That Matter coach. He presented this at a conference for the Teaching Skills That Matter, and he allows me to show it off everywhere because I think it's such a wonderful example of what students can do that can be part of both communicative practice, application, and evaluation. So in this case, they had a problem. What city should Tony move to? They had 3 choices, Durham, Philly, and Jersey City. As you can see, they made a mistake and put Durham twice, and they corrected that. And they had to do research looking at cost of living websites and Indeed.com and healthcare review websites based on the information they had about this family. And based on that, they came up with the solution of Durham, but they also had to identify what the consequences were of that decision. So you can see that in this poster, I think you can see in this poster, how much thinking is going on and how much language they're using that is their own way of expressing it. And I see that some of us are liking that. So I've talked a little bit about backward design, and I've shown you a lesson plan, and you've noticed and wondered about it. Let's expand our understanding by approaching the gradual release of responsibility. And I want to explain that the gradual release of responsibility is, the concept is not new. It's something that other people have spoken to, but Pearson and Gallagher coined the phrase in 1983. And it's a model for instruction that prompts us to intentionally shift our cognitive work from teacher modeling to joint responsibility between teachers and students to independent practice and application by the learner. Explicit teaching is occurring at the point of need. So what that means in terms of 21st century ESOL is that we want to keep our classes learner-centered. We know that that is good andragogy/pedagogy. We know that. We know that we need to provide instruction. So there's teacher-directed instruction. But where we want to go is from teacher-directed to learner-directed. And that's, we want to make sure that we're seeing that in our lessons. So let me really quickly go over the steps and where that would show up in the lesson. So the steps of GRR, or gradual release responsibility, are I do, we do, y'all do, and we say that in California when we're talking about GRR, and you do. So the idea is that I do, the teacher presents and demonstrates, we do, the teacher and students work together, y'all do, the students are working in pairs and teams, and you do is about students working independently to demonstrate their learning. So if I apply that lens to our lesson, when we started my lesson, we were in we do. We were community building, so we're working together. In the introduction and presentation, it's pretty much I do, I'm modeling, but there's interaction. I don't just talk at them, and the students are brainstorming skills, so there's a little bit of we do in there as well, but this is primarily in your lesson, the I do portion. Then there's the you do, so the student is confirming their understanding of the vocabulary independently. Then there's the y'all do. with guided practice and communicative practice. We go back to a we do. And then with the exit tickets, I'm on you do. So you can see it's a dynamic process. It doesn't have to stay sequential. It just has to be that we're making sure that there's sufficient explicit teaching to lead into expansive learner-directed instruction or learner-directed learning. And now, in the last few moments of our time together, let's take a reality check, because we're using textbooks, we're using Burlington English. And as I mentioned earlier, textbooks are a great resource. The 21st century textbooks have the correlation to the standards. They have lesson plans, they have flow. They are working their hardest to support instruction. What they don't have is as much customization as we would want, because we want everything to be made for us. They're not going to be that way. They're going to have to be more global in their approach, and in some cases, truly global. But if you look at a lesson, you can very often see the lesson plan pop out at you. So in this case, you've got a writing lesson. So you've got pre-writing. You've got pre-writing with preparation of ideas and pre-writing with planning. You've got the actual drafting going on. You've got editing and reading the email to a partner, which is partially publishing. What we don't have here is anything that specifically has the learners get feedback on their work. We've got a lot of comprehension checking. We've got a lot of good, there's we do in here and there's I do, but I'm not seeing as much y'all do. There's a little bit with the plan. So I would work with that. Then there's also the lesson plan that goes along with it. And if you take a look at this lesson plan, you can see that you're getting objectives, language focus, strategy focus. Now that strategy focus might not be right for my students. It says, teach students to include contact information at the end of an email. I might not want to do that. I might want to change it to something else, because for me, that doesn't necessarily match the objective I have. What you're looking for when you look at the material from your textbook is, do the objectives, assessments, and routines match? And before that, you're saying, are the objectives matching what I have said ahead of time I want my learners to be able to do? But this little part at the bottom, isn't that pretty? The correlation's there for you. So you could, if you trusted the textbook, you could go on that basis when you're looking for your correlations to the CCR and the ELP standards. You want to take a look at the actual routines that they're proposing. So is this routine something that you want to use, or do you want to use something else? This is really about our agency as instructors. So with that in mind, I'm going to answer a question, which was, where do you find, I think that the question is the OSHA Picture Dictionary, but I wonder if it's the OPD, the Oxford Picture Dictionary. If there's an OSHA Picture Dictionary, I'd go on the OSHA site, but the Oxford Picture Dictionary, I would check with your coordinator. They are everywhere, but you can take a look on the Oxford site as well, if that's what you're seeking. So I've answered that one. And so I'm going to ask you to take an assessment, and I want you to feel good about the assessment because A, it's anonymous, but I'd like you to check and see whether, on the basis of having listened so intently for the last 46 minutes, you feel comfortable answering the questions. So let's answer, show what you know. So go ahead and answer these questions, and I will share the answers with you in 90 seconds. Rachel, would you let me know if you're seeing the questions? Maria's asking a question while you guys are taking the test. Maria's asking a question about listening exercises. And there are some wonderful, what level, Maria, if you wouldn't mind letting me know. And thank you, Ryan. Well, there are some podcasts that are specifically for ESL that make wonderful listening. The 1 minute TED Talks, 1 to 3 minute TED Talks are excellent. If you're looking specifically for focus listening materials, I'd be very happy if you want to email me. I will give you my email here. And I'll be happy to just send you a link to the focus listening resources, that a folder that I have with all those. I hope this is giving you some intellectually chewy moments. We have about a quarter of the people that have responded, but I know this takes some reading. So we're going to go for another minute for sure. Hey, I know that's about half of you, and I think some of you may be in the midst of answering. Let me go ahead and share the answers. I'll share your results so that you can see, and then I'm going to share the answers. So the 3 stages of backward design is letter C: identify your desired results, determine evidence of learning, and create a learning plan. Now, the others are all important, but backward design is pretty specific to these 3. For number 2, when should the teacher plan the assessment that will provide evidence of learning transfer? Many people got this one correct. You would not look at the assessment until after you knew what the learning goals or desired results were. But the activities and tasks happen after you've got your assessment plan, because you want to think about what do they need to do in order to succeed at that assessment. And then what's false about an essential or driving question is that it always starts with how. Most of you got that correct. Terrific. This one is interesting, the one about which acronym best correlates to the changing role of the instructor. I can understand why CCRS might fall there. I can understand why WIOA might fall in there. But the answer based on our work today is GRR, because that's about the gradual release of responsibility, which is what we know. We need our learners to know that they have the agency to conduct their own learning, to be self-directed, to be self-efficacious. So that's an important element. And so with that, we're going to skip past one more assessment. The assessment is in the PDF, so I'll have you take a look at that. But I want to make sure that we have time for you to do the remaining parts. So I'm going to thank you for listening, noticing, wondering, and participating, and turn it over to June.
Jamie, thank you so much for that wealth of information. Right now, you're going to see a feedback slide that's presented on your screen. If you could take a few minutes, not a few minutes, a few seconds to answer these 3 short questions, we would love to hear your feedback. While you do that, I want to remind you that Jamie will be back with us next week, January 19th. And the topic will be differentiating ESOL instruction. It's not that different. So I hope that all of you will join us back next week as we continue our series of ESOL instruction and great strategies to get better outcomes for our students. Thank you. Be safe, be well, and thank you again, Jamie, so much. And thank you everyone for your participation today.